So we're covering 5 more builds, this time with the Dexterity ones. Gonna go over all the best ones in my opinion. Now there are gonna be lots of broken builds that just don't make it to the list, just like how I covered with the strength-based builds. But don't worry, I'm probably gonna make a different build video later on, where I can actually include some really good Dexterity weapons in some other different categories with some different infusions. So some of the best Dexterity weapons don't make it to the list. Don't worry, I'll probably end up covering it at a later date. The MILADY is one of the better weapons to come out of the DLC. It actually is really good with every single type of infusion, but does scale best off Dexterity, so that's what we're going to be building around today with the MILADY, and obviously the Wing Stance Ash of War, which is definitely the best pairing alongside with this weapon, as this skill is easily one of the best in the game due to its stun lock potential, how cheap it is, how easy it is to use, having a nice high damaging lunging attack, different damage types, and you actually can combo in the light attack and the heavy attack together to just output amazing damage and roughly 45 stance damage. And when paired along things like the Shard of Alexander and the Rolana's cameo, you could be doing well over 60% more damage. And then putting on the multi-hit talismans and the Thorny Cracked tier, you could be easily doing an additional 40% more damage on top of that. Now the build is just going to require you just going all into Dexterity. We are going to have a little bit of faith just for some different types of buffs. Things like Flame Gummy Strength, Beast of Vitality, and Blood Flame Blade, which you're not going to really be proccing bleed that quickly with this build because the weapon doesn't have innate bleed, but we're just going to have a Keen Infusion, so might as well just pair it alongside one buff. And with how quickly the movesets can be with the heavy attack into light attack combo, or the weapon skill R1, you might be able to proc bleed at least once or twice in a fight, and that's just more than enough. Now you will be noticing that I do have the Fire Spark perfume bottle just sitting in my back pocket, and honestly I recommend just using the Fire Spark bottle for almost every single Dexterity build, because it actually does give you an option of doing fire damage with these types of builds that you otherwise normally wouldn't have. You always end up getting access to lightning damage with Dexterity, but never fire damage. And honestly, the Fire Spark perfume bottles are actually decent. Now the only reason that I actually would use this over the MILADY is if I am fighting bosses weaker to fire damage, or if I'm fighting larger types of bosses, because that running heavy attack can actually output a decent amount of damage. You just use it at point blank range, and it can honestly melt these enemies really quickly, do decent damage and decent stance damage. Now unfortunately it actually doesn't work with the multi-hit talismans, so I would recommend putting on things like the Perfumer's Bottle, Fire Tier, and the Lacerating Cross Tree Talisman. And I also do have the Letters Armor set as well to just further enhance the running attack damage. But I definitely think it's a very good secondary option for Dexterity builds. You also can infuse it with things like Beast Roar or Rolling Sparks if you actually wanted to have a projectile option. And it doesn't weigh very much, so you can just very well just leave it in your back pocket and switch to it when you need it. Can't really talk about the best Dexterity builds without having to cover something like the BLOODHOUN'S FANG, which yes, does actually have somewhat of a good strength scaling as well, but you mainly have to go into Dexterity just to maximize your damage. Now the reason why this weapon is just so incredible is because it does actually have the good curved greatsword moveset. It does get the highest amount of damage compared to every other curved greatsword, and it also can be buffed, and it gets bleed, and it gets bonus damage and jumping attacks, so it is very much a noob friendly weapon, especially because you get it right at the beginning of the game and just requires Somber Stones. So obviously when paired alongside things like Blood Flame Blade and then just spamming the skill over and over again, it could definitely cheese a lot of different bosses, especially because the skill can actually output decent stance damage. It's very quick, you get an iframe dodge in the middle of it, and it also is very cheap in terms of FP cost. So to build around it, we're just going to have the Shard of Alexander on, and with how noob friendly it is, I might as well just go ahead and just pair it alongside some more or less noob friendly types of talismans. So things like the Crimson Sea Talisman and the Dragon Crest Greatshield Talisman. Obviously you can use the lesser versions of these talismans until you actually get there, but I think these talismans are like the best for survivability, and they just complement every single build perfectly. Now I do also have the Arrow Soaring Sting Talisman on, and the reason for that is because you are going to have the Arnspark's Longbow as well, because the only thing lacking with the Bloodhound's Fang is a projectile option and like synergy with spells, but with the Dexterity build we actually can get some okay damage out of our bows, and the Arnspark bow is probably the best amongst them because the skill does fire out like 8 arrows at once and actually can do respectable damage, still goes pretty far, and actually can do some decent status build up as well. So any single time that you're actually trying to hit enemies at a further distance, trying to pick enemies off one by one, or if you just are in situations where you feel like you would just benefit more off a projectile attack because it's easier to use, then you could just switch to the Arnspark bow. And in terms of arrows, I just recommend just going with the regular arrows. Like these ones are just the best ones to use. You could potentially try and farm for the blood arrows as well, but your weapon is already getting bleed, so it's not really the biggest deal. But in terms of your crystal tiers, I just have the Thorny tier and the Opaline tier just for more damage and more damage negation. Curved swords have the best power sensing combos in the entire game in my opinion, as they can just output the highest amount of DPS due to their really quick light attack combos, their amazing running attacks, and those jumping attacks are just cracked as well, as they hit like 4 times in quick succession. And with something like the Bandit's Curved Swords equipped, you can just get ridiculous amounts of damage. And thankfully you can get multiple Bandit's Curved Swords per playthrough. You don't have to farm for them, which can be a bit tedious. So you could just use like any other Curved Sword as an alternative, but this one is just the best one in terms of damage. And honestly, it doesn't really matter what attacks you can use alongside the Power Stance Curved Swords. You can can spam light attacks the entire time, spam running attacks, but I still do think the jumping attacks are most optimal, especially when you are going to lead off an encounter. So in terms of the damage boosting stuff, we are going to have the multi-hit talismans, the Thorny Cracks tier, and you can go the Raptor Feathers chest piece. All these things are either going to boost your jumping attack damage or just your damage as long as the attacking persists. We are also going to have the Opaline tier equipped just for some more damage negation. We also have 15 faith just to use things like Bestial Vitality, some potential like more damage negation spells, Flame Get Me Strength. And we do also have the Shard of Alexander on. But one thing that I always say is that you definitely want to have projectile attacks for every single type of build, because there are so many circumstances to where you actually would benefit off using them. And in that instance, it's going to be Stormblade. This attack is really quick, easy to use, it goes far, scales mainly off dexterity, and it's going to output a decent amount of damage. Now obviously you can pair this skill alongside things like a Great Katana or a Curved Greatsword and potentially get more damage at point blank range, but we're not going to be using it at point blank range because that's what our moveset is for. That's what the Power Stance combo is. So it's only when enemies are at a further distance that we're going to be using this skill, and the skill doesn't do any more damage at a distance. If you were to pair this thing alongside like a Curved Greatsword or a Great Katana, the damage is still the same. Now our offhand Bandit's Curved Sword is actually going to be infused with Braggart's Roar. Almost any single time that I'm going with like infusible Power Stance combos, Braggart's Roar is like a very good staple to have in the offhand because it is a weapon buff that just gives you 10% more damage, but it also gives you 10% more defenses and 20% faster stamina recovery speed. So it's like the perfect buff to just put in the offhand, and it is actually going to stack with your aura buffs and your body buffs, which in this instance we're going to have Golden Bow obviously infused onto a dagger and Flame Get Me Strength. But yeah, the entire build is just spamming jumping attacks, and when enemies get a bit further away, just spam Stormblade. Twin Blades are a very interesting weapon category in Elden Ring due to them just not really having good stance damage, having longer animations, and the total DPS can just be lower than most other quick weapons in the game. But one benefit that they actually do have is the ability to hit multiple times in quick succession. So obviously the multi-hit talismans make for just the perfect pairing, and with certain types of attacks, specifically the charged heavy attack, you can proc these buffs in an instant and just output ridiculous amounts of damage. Now yes, a power stancing build and spamming jumping attacks could just perform better in some cases, but I think for the most part, Power Stance Curved Swords will just outclass this because the entire Power Stance combo is really good, where for the Twin Blades, only the jumping attack is good, and I think the rest of the moveset is just outclassed by just the regular two-handed combos, which the Godskin pillar has the best two-handed Twin Blade moveset, because it gets a mix-up of poking attacks with its running heavy and its charged heavy, so it can just output the highest amount of damage compared to all the other ones, especially with a Keen Infusion. And when spec'd into a charged heavy attack build, you can get just as much damage as like the Power Stance jumping attack build, but with only having to level up one weapon, and actually just do more stance damage too. So obviously we're going to have this paired alongside the spiked tier and the two-handed talisman. You could go with the axe talisman until you actually get to the two-handed talisman. And we are also going to have the letters armor on as well, because the running heavy attacks of Twin Blades are just amazing, and the letters armor just boost running attack damage by 10%. And obviously going into 15 faith, so you can just use a bunch of different buffs. Also going to pair it alongside Blood Flame Blade as well, which any single time that you're going to go with like a Keen infused dexterity weapon, I recommend just slapping on Blood Flame Blade, because best case scenario, you just proc bleed like one time, and worst case, you're still just doing at least a little bit more fire damage. But with the Twin Blades, you very well can proc bleed maybe even twice against all boss fights. Now we are also going to have the Shard of Alexander on, because we're going to pair this alongside Ice Spear, because if you don't know, Ice Spear actually does scale off dexterity as well as intelligence, and there actually are certain circumstances to where it actually can get more damage with a dexterity build. And with this particular build, it can just shred, and Ice Spear is one of the best skills in the game, because it's a quick animation, it's really cheap, does high stance damage, and obviously can just proc Frost, which you can just lead off the fight with something like this, proc Frost first, end up debuffing the enemy to make them take 20% more damage, and then just go ahead and spamming your charged heavy attacks. Now one thing you do have to keep in mind is that if you are going to use Blood Flame Blade, the fire is actually going to reset the frost and remove the debuff, which is something that you don't really want to have. So you kind of have to pick and choose as to which status effect you kind of want to proc first, but just having the option of doing both is obviously not a bad thing. But yeah, the entire build is just spamming charged heavy attacks and running heavy attacks. Obviously, if you don't have longer openings, then the light attacks are going to serve you perfectly fine. And any single time enemies get a bit further away from you, or if you just want to proc Frost quickly, then just spam Ice Spear. Now, as for the last build, we're going to talk about the Raptor Talons. Now, I kind of did want to go with the Katana here, whether it be like the Uchi Katana or Nagakiba, but I'm probably going to save that one for the Arcane video. And I do think that Raptor Talons kind of performs better with a Dexterity build, because claw weapons are just amazing in the fact that they can output some of the highest DPS. It might not be as high as things like Power Stance Curved Swords, but typically the claws will actually get passive bleed, get 110 crit, they're going to have faster animations, so they're typically easier to use. And in the instance of the Raptor Talons, it's not going to get the highest amount of damage compared to some of the other claws, but it actually actually does get bonus damage and jumping attacks, and the best moveset. That heavy attack can lunge in really far, stagger enemies pretty well, hit simultaneously, and does get a follow-up heavy attack that actually has you retreat backwards, which I do think is a perfect complement to the actual regular claw moveset itself, which is just an absolute DPS machine. And when paired alongside things like the multi-hit talismans, Lord of Blood Excitation, the White's Mask, you can just destroy every single boss in the game. Now the downsides of claw weapons is they're not going to have much range and obviously have no hyper armor, but so you can throw things like Endure onto this weapon, which is what we have paired alongside with this, and you can just straight up cheese everything, because Endure gives you so much hyper armor and poise, to where you can basically tank every single attack in the game. And for the 3 seconds that it lasts, you also get 45% more damage negation too across all of your damage types. So not only you're not going to get staggered, but you're taking so much less damage, and you can stack this alongside the Opaline tier and the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, and you can just very well just R1 spam or heavy attack spam your way to victory and just not really take much damage at all. A couple of things that you might notice about the stats of this weapon. One is that we do have a lot of endurance, which typically you don't really need to have with the claw, but if we're just going to be spamming Endure and not really dodging, we can just keep trading out, just keep spamming Endure, keep spamming light attacks, and with this boosted endurance, we can actually get heavier armor to just get better defenses too. And also we do have that 15 faith, which I kind of recommend just going into 15 faith with every single build, because you can use things like Flame Gaming Strength, Beast of Vitality, other damage negation spells, and obviously Blood Flame Blade, which Blood Flame Blade probably pairs best with this weapon, more so than almost anything else in the game, because one, obviously it does get passive bleed, but it is a paired weapon, which has multiple different benefits. One of them is that you don't have to actually level up a second weapon just to gain the power stancing combo, and two is that with Blood Flame Blade, it actually adds the buff onto both hands. So you're getting roughly twice as much blood loss build up with this weapon than you otherwise normally would. Because yeah, the thing with claws is that they don't really get the most amazing weapon skill options, but they probably have the best light attack combo in the entire game. So pairing it alongside Endure kind of makes for a very stupidly broken build. Okay, that is the video now done. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. Now, the next video, I'm actually going to be ranking all of the talismans. There's like 150 talismans. I've been working on it for a little bit now. Hopefully, I do get it done within the next couple of days. But then after that, I actually will continue alongside the build videos. Most likely either doing top 5 faith builds or intelligence builds. Just let me know what you want to see next. And definitely do subscribe for those ones as well. And catch you guys around. Bye.